This work is with my very dear friend and colleague Tom Lucia, and it is very special for both Tom and I that I get to present this work here at Stanford. Because Tom and I, we met at Stanford. We started our graduate program at Stanford. Ria was actually also around at that time in the master's program. And we actually did, I think, our first homework together. And we have been the best of friends and colleagues ever since. And I'm so grateful for the partnership that we have. And I think we both get a lot out of it. So this is especially meaningful to both of us that we are sharing this work here. And right now, as Prashant mentioned, I'm at Michigan State University, and Tom is at Claremont Graduate University. There are a few other people I want to acknowledge, and then I'll get into the talk and the things I want to say. So there are many, many people who have made this research happen. This was funded by UNICEF, so obviously we thank UNICEF for funding it. There were colleagues at UNICEF who were quite important to us in guiding our thinking and sort of providing feedback along the way. We are very grateful to 6 graduate students, 3 at Michigan State and 3 at Claremont, who helped make this project happen, because without their help, we couldn't have done it. So I want to mention their names: Madhur Chandra, Ben Creed, and Jim Pippin at Michigan State, and Rebecca DeVero, Giselle Navarro, and Loris Fagioli at Claremont Graduate University. And all of these students have played an incredible role. And then, just many other people have stepped up in different ways to give us feedback and so forth. By the way, there is a seat here as well. I can just, this is my stuff. Okay, so I just want to acknowledge all of these people. Now, having said that, let me get into the talk, and let me just start by saying that I'm very happy for this to be a conversation, for you to interrupt me anytime you want. I have several things I want to say, but I'm very happy to sort of just see how this goes and take in feedback and comments as we go along. So, this talk is about teachers, right? And I want to talk to you about teacher distribution, which is what the study focused on. But there are a few things I think which are worth sort of reminding ourselves as we get into this conversation that I want to have with you. So there are a few things about teachers that are quite salient and important to remember. There is a lot of research that shows unequivocally that teachers are the single most important, if you call it input, or a resource that a policymaker can control or do something about that matter for improving learning. So teachers are very, very important. We get that, right? They're crucial. Teachers are important in another way as well. They are very important for education budgets. So in most developing countries in particular, but this is also true for more developed countries, teacher salaries are a significant portion of the education budget, up to 60, 70, 80%. What I have for you here is a chart you can barely see because the colors are not so helpful, but this is from the most recent global monitoring report, the UNESCO GMR 2015. And here is 100%, and here is sort of, it goes down. These are the countries. And what this chart shows us is the proportion of, so the orange dot is primary education budget, and this is the total education budget that is spent on teacher salary. So you can see that there are countries where almost 100% or close to 100% or up to 90% primary education budget is just spent on teacher salaries. So teachers are important, for learning, but they are also important from the perspective of education budget and education planning, right? They're important from that policy perspective for that reason. There is a third piece of information that is worth sort of reminding ourselves of, is that teachers are in short supply. And there are many different ways we can think about it, but one important thing that has happened is, as several of you would be aware, at the beginning of the 21st century, we put a major emphasis on enrolling more children in school. And we did well. We succeeded as a global community. The most recent report puts the number at 80 million. So 80 million new children have entered the school system in the last 15 years. That alone, like who's going to teach them, right? Short of having class sizes of 200 and 300 students, which has happened in some parts of the world, there really aren't very many ways we can teach these children without hiring new teachers. And so UNESCO Institute of Statistics every few years has been putting out numbers. So what is the teacher shortage? What is the estimated gap? And even most recently, like literally, we are already in 2015, and the report, the GMR that just came out a few weeks ago or a few months ago, notes that to reach the goal of universal primary enrollment, so which is just primary, not very ambitious, getting every child in primary school, and this is a report already being published in 2015, we need 1.4 million more teachers in as if just a year, right? And so, I mean, this is a real crisis in some sense if you think about it that way, that the shortage of teachers, period, and then qualified teachers. And then these are some other estimates, just to put some numbers to this, that this is something that is likely to persist by all estimates. We would expect to need some 3.5 million more teachers for primary, 5.5 million for secondary. So basically problems which are not going away anywhere. And this in itself, I think, is something which we can talk about, why the teacher shortage happens, or why do we see that in these countries. And there are many factors that sort of speak to it, and I'm happy to come back to this if necessary.
You mentioned 1.4 million additional teachers. In how many countries?
So, good. Yeah, thanks. You mentioned it. So, there are actually, this is a very interesting science in itself, how they make these estimates, right? So, the basic understanding is that the greatest teacher shortage is in Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, so some of the previous numbers, these numbers have now been updated, but some of the previous numbers showed that let's say if the world needed 5 million teachers, or let's say whatever, 3 million, 1 million of them would be needed in Sub-Saharan Africa. So that has been the focus. I mean, it's not North America that is facing teacher shortage to this extent as, say, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, some of the more developing regions of the world.
And in Sub-Saharan Africa, do teachers come really to classes? Because I know in some countries, teachers just get the salary and never...
So we'll talk, I want to talk about that. Yes, so let's talk about that. And you had a question.
Yeah, so just quickly, so that demand in South Africa, is that correlated?
Sub-Saharan, yeah.
Sub-Saharan,
So the whole,
regime?
this is the whole of, I'm talking about the whole continent. So not Sub-Saharan Africa, not South Africa. Okay. Yeah. But I want to come back to this question about teacher absence as well. So is it, this is not teacher absence. This is whoever is on the roster, we are counting them all. We are not even thinking about, are they showing up or not? That's sort of a separate question. But even just like doing that head count, if you wanted to maintain a pupil-teacher ratio of 40:1, like 40 students to a classroom, this is an issue. Yes, sir?
So one number I want is how many teachers is the 1.4 or whatever ratio to? How many teachers are there in the world?
That's a good question. I'll give you some numbers that I know which don't kind of fully answer the question. So India alone, the teacher labor force is around 6 million. The US teacher labor force is around 3 million. So that brings us to close to 10 million just in those two countries, right? So I don't have a sense of the world's teacher labor force. I kind of was thinking about that, and I just don't. Maybe somebody else in the room does. But, just India and US that I happen to know about puts us close to 10 million, right? And in India already there's a teacher shortage. So 6 million is not enough for India, as the Indian estimates show.
China's about 9 million.
Okay, China is 9 million, so that's 20, yeah.
Is there a specific kind of education, like Montessori teachers or like primary teachers?
These numbers usually, we don't have good data on teachers at younger levels. These numbers usually initially speak to primary teachers and then secondary, or as it says here, lower secondary teachers. And then, this is a whole sort of science in itself where you can go on presentations and read reports about how they calculate these numbers, because these are not easy numbers to back out, right? So there's a lot of assumptions that go into it. But here's sort of the story. Important, expensive, and in short supply, right? Just very briefly. Then, if you think about the general kind of literature that we know about teachers in developing country, and now, between India and China, we are already more than 15 million, and I'm sure many, many more. What are some of the common things in the literature that we are more commonly aware of? So, we just heard we are aware of teacher absence and accountability issues. We are aware that they don't do their job, they don't show up, and sort of we are aware of that narrative. We are also somewhat aware of this other narrative that shows that, even if you train them, they don't really perform so well, sort of the challenges of those kinds of performance issues. There is also a very interesting line of research that I think has a lot of promise, where what scholars are now doing is comparing teachers in public and private schools, because their salaries are very, very different. So there is a paper that they have used data from India. Land Pritchett is an economist from the World Bank, and where they compare some of these sort of salary differences and talk about how efficient or inefficient the public system is. So these are some of the narratives that we are aware of around teachers in developing countries. You know, one sort of thing that comes to mind, I don't know how many of you have seen this World Bank report, and then maybe the lighting is not right, but this is a picture of a teacher kind of fallen asleep on his desk and, you know, not doing his job. So this is a narrative that we are generally, that comes to mind when we think about teachers in developing country. Oh, they don't show up, they are not accountable, they are not doing their job, they are not performing, they get paid too high, very high salaries and all that. If we ask, what do we know about teacher distribution? What do we know about who teaches whom, who teaches where? The fact is we don't know very much. So, you know, there is there was a note in this 2010 Global Monitoring Report which focused on marginalized children, and it said that it is likely that this teacher shortage has very severely negative consequences for children who are marginalized. So what I'm saying is that if you have this resource that is in short supply and expensive, what is happening to the children who are most deprived? What kind of teachers do they have access to? And we don't know very much, right? There are some scholars like Motoko Akiba who has done excellent work on teachers internationally. They speak about this potential quality gaps. So the gap between the kinds of teachers that children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have access to and upper economic socioeconomic background. But the bottom line is that when we started this project, we really, from the literature, could derive very little systematic understanding of what does teacher distribution look like, you know, in a broader context. Now, Tom Lushai, Tom's own dissertation work did speak to the same question. He focused on Mexico in his dissertation, but we still didn't have a sense of sort of the broader context. So this is the study we set out to do, sort of in a nutshell. We set out to ask these, in some sense, two simple questions, but you know, rather ambitious, we thought when we started. We were a little scared that we might never finish the work. But we wanted to know what is the teacher distribution, or who teaches children who are most marginalized across, we asked, 21 countries or education systems, because these are not all technically countries that we have in our sample. And we made some good use of various data sets that I'll talk about in a couple of slides to answer that question. And then we also wanted to understand why this might be the case, right? To the best of our ability, what might explain some of these patterns of distribution that we see in this setup. And so for this piece, we picked 3 countries, India, Mexico, and Tanzania. And we went to these countries and we conducted interviews with 30, 40 officials to sort of try and understand what might explain these patterns that we are seeing in our data. So this is basically the study, right? So trying to answer these 2 big questions. And, you know, because UNICEF was involved, I mean, there was a great deal of interest in generating policy recommendation and all that stuff. But as scholars, I mean, this is how we sort of thought about this work. So one of the things that we had to do, you know, I know there are some students in this room and you often sort of fight with the conceptual framework, like what is conceptual framework? You know, it's a way to back out from the minute details and think about sort of the big picture of the project. So let me tell you how we conceptualize just very briefly those 2 questions, or rather our approach to those 2 questions, because I think it's useful and it also highlights some of the limitations of our work. So the first piece is pretty simple in some sense. You know, we are simply trying to say who teaches whom, right? That means that we need to identify a set of student attributes, a set of teacher attributes, and then look at the matching. And in the US, there is an excellent tradition of this work. Susanna Loeb and her colleagues have done some very interesting work. So in some sense, we are kind of doing that, just that, you know, seeing that matching. And then we suppose if we find that a poor child has a teacher with 5-year experience and a rich child has a teacher with 10-year experience, then that is the experience gap. There's a 5-year gap between the rich and poor in terms of teacher experience. So these are the ways in which then you establish the gap. And if we find that the gap is favoring the rich child, so the rich child is getting the better educated teacher or more experienced teacher, then we call it an equity dampening situation, because it's worse for the poor child, right? If we find the reverse, if we find that, oh, you're a poor child and you get to have the very best teachers, the most trained, the most experienced, and so forth, then that's an equity enhancing situation, where this is the kind of sort of way in which you would hope to make up for some of these other social limitations that the child might otherwise face. So that's really the simple idea. But now there are a whole bunch of complications to think about. The first, one of the very important one is, how do we think about different teacher attributes as positive or negative, right? So teacher education, we can say that more educated is better, even though the evidence is not clear that education makes a big difference, but it's easy, we can say that's better. With teacher experience, maybe potentially we can say something like that too. One teacher attribute that is challenging to categorize is teacher sex or teacher gender. Is male and female, how do we think about the maleness or the femaleness of the teacher? Is it a good thing, is it a bad thing? And so here we had to make a call, right? Because we had to sort of think about all of these things. And based on our understanding of the literature, we decided to identify an overexposure to male teacher as sort of an equity dampening thing. The idea being that there is so much literature that talks about how female children have not enough role models, the importance of female teachers, that this is how we set it up. Now, it's not that we think that is, I mean, Tom, my friend, he's a fantastic male teacher himself. So it's not that we think in itself, maleness or femaleness means anything, but you see how there are all these sort of decisions involved, right? The other issue is on the student side. So how do we identify a child who is marginalized? That's a complicated question too. One of the key indicators of marginalization that the world is talking about more and more is disability, right? In different kinds of disability. Most of these large-scale data sets that we have used have no measure for disability. They just don't, right? So that's a big limitation of our work. We can't do that. We can't do that analysis. The other issue is, the reviewer pointed out, he goes, what about children who are not in school? And we said, yeah, what about them? They don't have teachers. But his point was that they are not in school because maybe they previously had poor teaching experience. And that's true. We have lost them too because we are looking at data sets in the school system. There are household data sets where we can see a child who's not in the school system, but then for that child, we will not have information on her or his teacher. So we were limited to using the data sets that are available, and which caused the study to be constrained in some ways, where the way we define marginalization, the way we, or rather I should say operationalize marginalization, or the teacher attributes, I mean, they were defined or contained by the data set. So I just want to point this out as sort of a, I mean, just in thinking about this systematically was helpful, and this was also helpful when we brought together those 5 different data sets, right, to speak to one another, because we had this roadmap, we could do it more systematically. And then with the second piece, which is trying to understand why do we see, what might explain the patterns we see. I mean, this is sort of a, much more, I mean, we obviously think that the social, economic, political environment is important. And then we decided to think of this in a supply and demand framework. So we said, let's understand the teacher side, what are their preferences, why do they choose to work here versus there, and so forth. Let's understand the demand or the policy side. Let's understand both of those. Let's pay particular attention to these different sort of signposts posts in a teacher's career, the recruitment, retention, retirement, and so sort of, to think about some of these questions. So this is how we set up the second piece of the conceptual sort of thinking for the second piece. So this then, again, for the students in the room, this helped us think about our interview protocol, like what are the questions we want to ask. Otherwise, it's very, like you go in, what are the things you want to focus on? But this gave us some roadmap to work with in designing and thinking about those kinds of things. All right, so I'll tell you a bit about our data, and then I'll show you the results we have. So these are the data, and again, this might be of more interest to some in the room, for all kinds of reasons. So, and this also has the list of countries that we looked at, and so and it'll show up one more time, but this is also, you can take a quick look at the range of countries we were able to look at. So one is just the power that this kind of large-scale analysis gives you, right? That you can actually do this all at once. And Tom and I have, more and more come to see the value of this and sort of the benefit that one can derive from this kind of work. So for Latin America, we use the CERCE data. CERCE is the second, I could not say the whole thing, maybe somebody in the room can pronounce it, but secundo or something. And now the terce have also come out,
Yeah, el segundo estudio regional comparativo y explicativo.
That, exactly, right. And then the terce has come out, which is the third round of these data have come out. So we picked 8 countries from there and, had some logic in picking those. Then for Asia, we were a little stuck. We didn't have anything better than the TIMSS data, which some of you might be familiar with as well. TIMS are a fine data set, but they tend to be a little bit more biased towards the more developed countries, just the way they are set up. We wanted to analyze India, but India does not show up in any of these big cross-national studies. So we were really stuck with India. We had some, we just could not do some of the analysis on India the way we wanted. And I'm happy to talk about those kinds of challenges as well. And all our UNICEF weight or nothing worked. We just couldn't get those data for India for our analysis. For Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, we used 2 data sets. PASEC is the data set that focuses on Francophone Africa. And SECMEC is a data set that focuses on Southern and Eastern Africa. So that gave us 9 countries to work with. And so we had a very nice spread in terms of country background and so forth, right?
But in the India region, we didn't take, for instance, Cambodia and Myanmar and the worst.
Very true. So that is because we were limited by this TIMS data set. And as I mentioned, TIMS it is biased towards the more developed. So we are not thrilled with our Asia sample. We don't have, the best thing would be exactly Vietnam and Cambodia and Myanmar and sort of Pakistan, Bangladesh. We just don't, India, we couldn't even get India. That's exactly right, but we don't have that. And that's a limitation of the way this was set up. And by the way, this was a project that we had promised UNICEF. So we had 9 deliverables. We had promised them so many deliverables that some of it is also sort of trying to be finishing this in 16 or 18 months that we had given ourselves. So there was that too, which was, but yeah, this is a challenge with, and at least right now, I'm not aware of any systematic this kind of school-based data collection that covers South Asia adequately. Like CERS and PASEC, we should do something like that in South Asia. And perhaps some people are thinking about it. And then the qualitative piece, we had, as I said, 30 to 40 interviews. We went to India, Mexico, and Tanzania. In each of these countries, we tried to identify, pick regions which, based on our understanding or people who were helping us, showed some diversity in sort of the country background. So in India, we had the state of Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, and Rajasthan. In Mexico, Chiapas, the federal district, Yucatan, and Zacatecas. And in Tanzania, Arusha, Dar es Salaam, and Lindi. So that's where our data came from. Okay, so I've done sort of all the background work, right? What is the study about? The teacher distribution, what is it? Why is it the way it is? What did we do? Where the data came from? Now let me show you what we found, okay? And again, please just stop me anytime when you want. So this question, who teaches the marginalized children? So there is a very nice paper. Susanna Loeb and her colleagues have done some very interesting work on these questions. And so we kind of took their approach or their method in thinking about this. And really what we did, in some sense, is a simple exercise, as I was mentioning a little bit previously. We said, let's take a low SES child and a high SES child, right? So a child in the bottom 10%, the top 10% of SES. Then let's see who's teaching them. So let's connect them to their teacher data, which is possible in all of these data sets. Then let's see what is the average characteristics of those teachers. So if I have 100 poor children, 100 rich children, what do their teachers look like on average, right? So now I have these 2 figures that I have pulled out. Oh, the average experience of a poor child's teacher is 7.5 years. For a rich child is 20 years, right? So now I have those 2 figures. Then let's get the difference between these 2. So whatever, the difference, 12.5 or so forth. So now that the difference is the gap, right, that we have just calculated. What we decided to do was to calculate the gap in such a way that if it was an equity dampening thing, worse for a poor child, then it would be a negative number, right? If it was a positive, then it would be a positive number. So that was the number. And then finally, as you know, we had a range of teacher attributes, teacher education, teacher sex, teacher, experience and all that. So we had to bring this all on some comparable scale, no? Because 15 years here, 0.5 there. So we standardized all of this on a scale of 0 to -1 to +1. So we put everything on a -1 to +1 by just sort of, dividing by a denominator to make sure that these numbers kind of can come to that on the scale. So what that essentially did was it gave us a way to look at all our data. Because think about this. If we had 10 student attributes and 10 teacher attributes, that is 100 gaps, right? and then we have 100 gaps in 21 countries. That is just too much information to kind of get yourself confused with. So these are some of the ways in which we kind of teased out the information that we thought was most valuable, of course, giving up a lot of other insights in the process to create this information. And we did this two ways. So we asked the question, who teaches whom? So what is the gap in the teacher quality, or I'm using the term quality very loosely here, teacher attributes of a marginalized and a non-marginalized child? And also we asked, who teaches where? So this is the analysis that we did by school attributes. So, urban and rural school, large and small school. So these are the two analyses that we basically conducted, right? So yes.
How do you consider post-retirement teachers? So like some teachers are really old,
Yeah.
but they are not so, they do not have enough energy to teach. Let's say they are 80 years old or something.
Yeah, so they don't show up. So they don't show up in this data set. These are the pluses and minuses of working with pre-existing data, right? That, these are data. So the way all of these data sets were collected that we relied on, in each of these cases, they went to the school. The sampling was school and within school classroom, right? And so what that means is, by the virtue of the way the data were collected, you only see the teachers who are within the school system in that particular year or time frame or whatever. Okay, so now with all of that, the final challenge remained. So we had now, let's say, I don't know, all these numbers backed out, but we still have thousands of numbers to think about. So we were still sort of struggling to see how can we provide a presentation that would be meaningful, useful, and quick. So we came up with a graphical approach as best as academics can, and we are actually, I think this works well, we are pleased with it. So let me explain to you how this graph works, and then after this, I can sort of show you a bunch of pictures, and I think you'll see the patterns kind of will be evident. So what is happening in this graph is, so this is sort of representing the gap that we've been talking about, right? So the panels, you see these vertical panels, they compare the teachers. So the first panel compares the teacher of a child who is high performing in math to a low performing child, right? The second panel compares the teacher of a high SES child to a low SES child. This compares the teacher of a child whose mother has high levels of education to a child whose mother has no education. This compares the teacher of a child who speaks the language of the test at home to a child who does not. And often that can be an indication of marginalization, right? Because you might be an immigrant or might be indigenous and so forth. So that's the panel. Then this is the zero line. See? So whenever you see a bar below the zero line, that means it's a negative number, right? And that means it is an equity dampening situation. It's sort of worse for the poor child. And so, it's sort of equity dampening. And if you see it above the zero line, it's a positive thing. So then, if you take any of these panels, these bars, the colored bar themselves, they are the teacher attributes. And so what do these what do these bars represent? And these are not all the attributes we looked at, but the ones we picked out for the graphs. So this color coding, I think, sort of works nicely to see this picture quickly. So the blue bars are teacher demographics. So they are teacher age, experience, and teacher maleness. Is the teacher male or female? The green bars are the more traditional variables that we are used to thinking, education, training, that kind of stuff. And then the orange bars are, some of the more qualitative pieces of information that different data sets provided, like, in this case, how satisfied are you, do you want a reassignment, and so forth. In some other data set was something different. So basically, with this information, if you just glance at this picture, what is the assessment that whichever country this is, teacher distribution seems to be equity dampening, right? Because you see most of the bars are below the zero line. So this is sort of, gives you the snapshot. And the other thing to note is that it's equity dampening, not just in terms of the education and training, but also in terms of teacher demographic. The children who are, marginalized have disproportionate access to younger, inexperienced, and male teachers too. Right? So that's basically the sort of the snapshot story that this picture tells you. So now let me show you the results from, let's say, 3 countries in 3 different, parts of the world: Guatemala, Indonesia, and Namibia. And again, if you just glance at this picture, what is the overall story? And these are 3 obviously different countries in 3 different world regions, right? What is the overall sense that you get? There's much more below zero than there is above zero, right? That's sort of the first observation. I mean, Indonesia, there is nothing pretty much above 0. Sometimes when you see nothing, that means that that thing is completely equally distributed, right? But otherwise, it's much more below 0 than there is above 0. And also what is very striking, and so this is the thing that we were really struck by in our data. And Tom had noticed some of this in his dissertation work, but we just, the consistency was striking. So we were expecting the green bars to look this way. I mean, so for teachers of the children who are more privileged to be more educated and more trained and so forth. But we were struck by the blue, right? The consistent seeming pattern that the teachers of children who are more marginalized are younger, inexperienced, and male. Right? And you see that happening in sort of pretty much, all of the pictures, right? I'll show you the pictures, I mean, the results for where we do this analysis by school, and that the patterns are a little unclear. The school data have some other limitations as well, but you kind of see generally the same patterns. So now again, there are 3 different countries, Mexico, Thailand, and Mozambique, right? And if you just eyeball this data, this a very similar picture emerges, right? Especially if you look at these blue bars. I mean, you see pretty much they're consistently below the 0 line in each of these cases. Right? Some of the things to pay attention to, for example, is this is comparing schools in urban and rural areas. So what kind of teachers are available to urban schools and rural schools, where urban is a good thing? In each of the pictures, the last panel compares urban and rural. And it is striking, right, that in Mexico, in Thailand, and in Mozambique, you see the patterns in the urban-rural comparison. It's consistently, the blue bars are below 0, or which means that teachers of children who are marginalized tend to have more, or, they have access to younger, less experienced, and disproportionately more male teachers. Right? So this basically is sort of, what this, and this was a lot of work to back all of this out. But these were the descriptive patterns that emerged from looking at this data. And as I said, what was very striking to us was not just the qualification gap. So the greens, that fine, they have less training or they have less preparation. We kind of expected that. But we were really struck by that what what anybody can call the demographic gap, right? That the differences in their demographic patterns. Yeah, so we haven't talked much about them, but so they are sort of, a little bit all over the place, in which I was just thinking that in itself is something interesting to look at. So let's just maybe take a minute. I'll show you, and this picture is a little bit easier to look at. So in Guatemala, so in the CERCE data, that is, do you have a permanent job? Are you doing a second job? How satisfied are you? And do you want reassignment? So the lightest orange, which you can barely see, is does the teacher want to go someplace else? And it is interesting. It is yes, 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 yes for all the teachers of children who are marginalized, whichever way you think about marginalization, right? The teachers want to get away from there, right? According to this data. In here, in the TIMSS data, it is safety, school climate, and working condition. So how safe do you feel? How good do you think the school climate is? And what is your working condition? And again, here you see it is, I don't feel as safe. I don't feel my conditions, and all of that stuff. Yeah, and I'll come to you in a minute. Let me just sort of finish this, and then this is the SACMEC data. And this is sort of, actually, yeah, this is similar to the CERCE data. As the same permanent, do you want other job satisfaction? And so here in Namibia, you don't see really that much going on with those variables. They seem to be sort of, and so actually, and the oranges don't necessarily line up always in the same way, but on the whole, they do tend to show, one might argue, that teachers who teach in these circumstances are more keen for reassignment or less satisfied or safe and so forth. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yes. How do you compare madrasa situations like Iran and more Islamic countries? I guess those data will not show up.
We don't have those data. There is some very interesting work on madrasas by Tahir Andrabi and his colleagues in his work at the World Bank. Tahir Andrabi is a professor at Pomona, and they have done some very interesting work on madrasas. So, I couldn't speak to it, but you might want to look up his work. I think it's very good work. Yes?
Two fast questions.
Yes,
In
please.
these countries or the others you're going to show me, is there any attempt by the country to redistribute teachers for the benefits of the marginalized? And secondly, is the data purely public, government type education, and do the privileged private people, are they off the chart as far as this study?
Good question. So the first question, which is what are the government policies? We'll speak about that in a minute because I want to show you some. No. But that's absolutely. So what are, at least what we learned from India, Mexico, and Tanzania. And then this is a very interesting question. Who the private school teachers are. To be honest, I will just have to say that I don't remember if our data include private schools. I kind of want to think not. But I just, that's just my memory is failing me. But actually, private school teacher labor market is a very interesting, I think, area of study in its own right for a whole host of reasons. So we can, maybe speak about that too. If yes, please. Yes. Yes, good question. Thank you for asking. So we, because I told you we were using pre-existing data sets, so we were limited by whatever grade level that they, because usually what these kinds of data sets do is that they would say, we'll go and survey all the, whichever grade, right? So the CERSE data are 6th grade. The PASEC data, which you don't see on this slide, are 5th grade. SECMEC is 6th grade, and TIMS is 8th grade. So basically this is between 5 and 8, mostly between 6 and 8. 19 countries are between 6th and 8th grade, 6th grade and 8th grade. And then, so we don't have primary school children. We don't have this kind of data, CERSE or SECMEC or whatever, at primary level in these countries. So, yeah. It's a good question. I don't think this data would allow us to answer a question like the salary condition. We have some understanding of the climate, I mean, like, what the principal thinks the school climate is and all that based on that response, but we don't have a very good data set for if you're in sort of teacher back, like those kinds of questions, is the TALIS data. TALIS does not have a lot of these developing countries, but it has some of these questions. What TALIS does not have is it has no student data. So you only have, so there are some, I mean, these are some of the challenges when you want to work with big data, you kind of, but you still get so much out of it that it's a worthwhile effort, right? Okay, so I'll just show you now. I mean, this is sort of the main point in the sort of answering the first question, right? That we see uneven patterns of uneven distribution, we see a qualification gap, and we see a demographic gap, right? So underqualified, less trained, less educated, and also disproportionately more male, young, and inexperienced. And now very quickly what I will do is I'll show you like these screen grabs of all our countries at once. I mean, so there's a lot of countries, but you kind of get the feel for it. So this is all the Asian countries in our data, yeah? And so I mean, if you just eyeball, you see a lot of stuff going on below the 0 line. Now, Hong Kong stands out as an exception, right? Like in Hong Kong, you see the things are different. And I mean, clearly, Hong Kong and Indonesia are so different in so many ways, right? I mean, if you think about the geography or the systems and so forth. So this is sort of the Asian picture. But again, I mean, if you look at the blue bars, it is pretty striking. This is Latin America. And again, Cuba, perhaps not unexpectedly, is more egalitarian, where you see a lot of stuff happening above the 0 line, but otherwise, I mean, Guatemala, we were looking at Mexico, Uruguay, I mean, it's just, things are just, not really, and then Chile is a bit more like Cuba and more egalitarian. And then, sorry, is this a question? Yeah, yes.
About Chile, it does have my attention because it seems to be more equal, more equal environment. Do you know if that might have something to do with the education level that you're studying here, because maybe gaps come after or before?
That is likely, yeah. I couldn't speak to that sort of competently, but I think that is entirely likely that, at primary levels, maybe some of these things look very different, or maybe at much higher levels, some of these things look. Yeah, I think that is, I mean, that is entirely likely. And then this is, yes.
Surprised me about Taipei, Taiwan. Taiwan is a developed country, democratic country.
Yeah.
And still the blue bars.
Yeah. No, I know, yeah, exactly. I mean, there are some scholars in the room here who know much more about China and the region than I do, and I don't even know calling it a country or what's the politics on that.
If we were to do this for the U.S., would it look much different than Taipei?
I don't know. That's a very good question. I don't know. The gender piece might be so prominent in the U.S. No, what do you think? I just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, based on Susanna Loeb's work in New York, it seems like you also have this kinds of deficiencies in the United States.
Right.
For example, in New York,
New
you
York.
see lower socioeconomic class students. They don't have the best teachers by any means.
Yeah.
And there's a movement of teachers away from those schools to schools where kids' social class is higher.
Yeah. No, that is very true. Absolutely. Yes, you had a question.
I have a question. How come Cuba is more Italian? If we always listen to the news that it's always a broken country,
I really is the socialism, is the egalitarianism that everyone is poor but everyone's equally poor or something like that. I mean, sort of is a way of thinking about it. And again, I'm not an expert. When you work on 21 countries, you have to say right away that I know. I mean, I just am not an expert on each of these, right? So I don't want to. Maybe somebody else in the room again has something to. Yeah, but I think we see actually. I'll show you something in Malawi in a minute. And I'm sorry, but there's a question here as well. Did you want to ask something? And then I'll come to you. Yes, please. Did you want to go first?
Okay.
Yes.
I think this might be a tough question because of data limitation, but I'm wondering how much of the inequality is driven by within school variation. So I think across school variation is very difficult to adjust.
Right.
People choose where to live, right, depending on the economic status. But within school, inequality might be easier to adjust. But in China, I'm from China, I know that
Right.
a lot of school assign the best teachers to the best students.
Correct.
And they have different levels of
Correct.
classes within the school.
Correct.
So I'm not sure whether you have any information.
Yeah. So this is a good question. These are all across school comparisons, simply because in most of these data sets, we only observe one or at most two teachers per school. So we really are limited and unable to understand the within school teacher distribution, which is a very important point. And again, for that, a data set like TALIS is promising. But the problem with TALIS is, because in TALIS you will see many teachers in the same school. But the problem with TALIS is that you have no data on the students of these teachers. So you only see the teacher, but then you can't do the next step and say, who are you teaching? You might have some questions around that. But so I think it's a good point. We don't have, but one sec, I think she wanted to go first. Yes.
Just a very quick question. Just as you're thinking about sort of comparatively across these different countries, what sort of equity situation you have, do you think at all about the sort of enrollment rate overall across these different marginalized and non-marginalized?
Yeah, what is the proportion of students enrolled? That's a good question. To be honest, I know it's not like I have some data I could pull up and show you. But clearly, see, that's also an important point that in an education system like in Malawi or I don't know, I think Malawi is a good example. We are looking at children who are in 6th grade, by which time, I mean, this is already a privileged group, right? So, we are already looking at even in the so-called marginalized, these are the more privileged in the overall sense of the country. And so this was a critique of which one of the, referees at UNICEF sent the work out to say that what about children, as I said, who are not in the school system? Well, I said, we can't look at them. But to your point, these data are already looking at sort of the upper class in some sense in some of these countries. Not in every country, because in some countries, right. No, that's a good point. There's a very nice paper in CER by this scholar Nick. I want to say his last name is Spaull, Paul. I'm not sure I'm saying it right. But what he has done is he has brought together, he's from South Africa. I think actually he'll be at Stanford mostly in a couple of months is my sense. I don't know, Chiki, is it you know who I'm talking about? But at any rate, he has compared, what he did was he brought together two different data sets. So demographic and health survey data, which is where he got the in-school, out-of-school information, and then the SECMEC data to ask some of these questions. So here is some interesting analysis. It's a CER paper that was, I think it came out just a few months ago. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Just quickly, is the orange line that's above, so
Uh-huh.
pro poor or pro whatever the marginalized dimension you're looking at is that more likely to be a permanent teacher?
That's a good question. The only data set where actually, you know what? No, that's not true. Maybe it is here. We don't know. We didn't ask it.
Okay, so it's a different.
Oh wait, sorry. Well, maybe I'm misunderstanding your question. You are asking. Oh, I see. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right. That is true, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. So these are permanent teachers who seem to be sort of more pro-poor than otherwise. Yeah, right. Exactly, yeah, that's true. And then there is a whole business of contract. Yes, Chiki?
No, go ahead.
Oh, no, just there's a whole thing of contract teachers. And, there's only one data set that we had, the PASEC data, that gave us reasonable information on contract teachers. Yes?
Yeah, I think part of the explanation for Cuba is if you start with the idea that countries with lower levels of income inequality are going to be ones where the distribution of resources in schools will be more equal.
Right.
You could look at each of these cases, and for some of them, you probably have Gini coefficient and see whether, in fact,
Exactly.
it is the case that you get more. That the lower the Gini coefficient, the more you're getting some of those spikes
Exactly.
above the zero.
Exactly. I think absolutely. So to Chiki's point, let's look at this is the African data. Namibia, Botswana are some of the most unequal countries in the world. I think Namibia's Gini coefficient might be or South Botswana might be like highest at 60 or 70. When the US is also unequal, but it's around in the 40s. So I mean, they are that unequal. And to Chiki's point, you see exactly that sort of consistent unequal pattern in Namibia. In Malawi or in Benin and some of these countries which are otherwise poor, but the level of poverty is so much higher that everybody's poor. And so the equity comes not necessarily from a good place, but it's because it's a poverty that, kind of everybody's equally poor, so to speak, right? So this is sort of the Africa snapshot, and this is missing Guinea, but you kind of get the picture. So this is the first piece of trying to understand, and I think what we have, I think, we feel comfortable saying that we do see a generally compelling systematic cross-national evidence that teacher distribution is uneven. And then, there are many other sort of ways to improve upon this, but anyway, here's the first piece. Now let me tell you a bit about, and we have, 30 minutes, so we'll just see, not 30, maybe 35. Let me tell you a bit about why, we try to understand why is it the case, right? What might explain some of these patterns. And for this, what we did was we went to these 3 countries, tried to talk to people, and so on and so forth. Before I do that, I want to give you some context, which I think is important, to sort of set the overall narrative. So just to get this out of the way, by the way, before I scare you with that slide, there's going to be a very busy slides. I have a lot of quotes that I have put up because I simply can't remember them all. And some of them I want to read to you, some of them we will not read, but they are mainly just quotes. And the effort that we try to make is find similar themes in our 3 countries, in Mexico, in India, and Tanzania, so that we can reasonably say that this is maybe a pattern or something worth thinking about. Okay, so just to get this out of the way, there's sort of standard explanation that, there is no transparency and everybody's cheating and nobody's doing their work. It's there. I mean, we definitely see evidence of that. It's no question, right? So, this sort of quote from India that in the more challenging districts, there is they don't have enough administrative support. The officer will come, will see the toilet, they will see the meal, but they will not focus on the academic aspect. So yes, we see that. We also heard in India, we heard in Mexico that there is political sort of, rent or that kind of, assignment that you assign me here because I'm the political relative of so-and-so. So we heard about that too. There is that kind of, corruption also present. And we also see how teacher vacancies make all of this hard. So, like this quote from India, that there are 300 vacancies and 250 teachers. The best ones will get filled and the remote villages will not get the right teacher amounts, right? So we see that too. Or, this quote in Tanzania speaks to sort of their classic, teachers don't want to do their job. So yes, somebody said that. There is a tendency for teachers, once they're allocated, they don't report, they don't go to these schools, they stay in the street. That's a problem, but what can we do? There is a deficit of teachers, and so we just take them even though they are not very good. Or that it is very impossible to discipline a teacher, no accountability, right? So it is very hard to get rid of an underperforming teacher. So all of that stuff is there very much, right? And also sort of on a slightly more positive note, we also saw examples of how some of these things were being rectified. This is, again, a busy slide. But we did see in India, in Mexico in particular, I mean in those 2 countries in particular, more and more effort to use technology to sort of streamline the process and so forth. So there is that happening too. And to bring more accountability into the system. And Afghanistan is obviously not in our study, But just interesting examples of how teachers might get paid their salary on the mobile phone. So, your money comes to you. You don't have to, there is no cut in between. You don't have to expend undue effort. Because in Afghanistan, where everything is broken, there are no local banks where you can go draw your salary, so things like that. So there is, yes, that explanation is very much there, the lack of transparency, accountability, all of that. And in many of these instances, we also see examples of people trying to work around some of these issues. And again, we can talk a bit more about that if there is an interest. But there is a whole lot of other things going on, right? I mean, that is not the only story. The accountability and transparency and corruption is not the only story. That's not the only way to understand these teacher labor market issues. And so I want to tell you about those two and sort of build that richer narrative. So one thing that came up very clearly in our talking to people and also in the literature a little bit is that the working conditions of these teachers are exceedingly difficult. They often work in understaffed, under-resourced, multi-grade classrooms, so you're teaching more than 2 grades at the same time. I just want to quickly read you some of these quotes. So this is a quote from India. This is a major problem. 2 teachers and 5 classes. How would the teacher teach fruitfully? 5 classes would have almost 100 children. Now 2 teachers can only make students sit forcefully. There would be no teaching. What would happen to the child in such a situation, even if the child would play, etc.? You get the point. I mean, so this is, the conditions of some of these teachers. Or in Mexico, and this is something we also saw in India. So this is a lone school in the middle of nowhere, and this is the only teacher. The teacher who is in a multi-grade school, so teaching multiple grades at the same time, is a teacher, but she also has to clean the school, receive training, has to go turn in paperwork, maintain the school, and it all takes time. And this is true. They're often the cook, the cleaner, everything of the school, because they are the only staff. And this is something, I have a student who's doing a very interesting dissertation on Pakistan right now, and I'm learning some of this through her work, and some of this we also know in India, that often government teachers will double up as all kinds of other service providers. Because in the village, they would be the only source of receiving this service. I heard somewhere recently, someone in some other context, that there are more teachers than there are nurses. And so you can think of teachers as a way to provide more health guidance. And that makes sense. It's understandable. But then when does the teaching happen, right? Because if you're doing all of this other stuff, maintaining and running, and in addition teaching, so the working conditions, especially of the teachers who are most marginalized, are quite challenging. And that's sort of something that is important to note. Also, a piece of context that is important to note is that this is something that, again, came up in all our visits, is that so on the one hand, they work in difficult situations, and on the other, it's not that they receive the right kind of training, pre-service or in-service or support or education to work in that situation, right? So the quality in general of pre-service and service training is low. And we have this is a very cynical, but I think kind of maybe respondent from India. And then listen to what he has to say. So in India, we have the Bachelor of Education. I'm from India, by the way. So in India, we have the Bachelor of Education degree, which is like the degree that makes you eligible to teach at all kinds of different grade levels. So this guy goes, there are 3 important days to get the B.Ed degree. First day to take admission, second day to give examination, and third day to take the degree. Nothing happens in between. So those who have a B.Ed degree, that does not mean that this person is trained in pedagogy, right? I mean, it's just that bad. And I mean, this is, I think, a whole topic of research in its own right. In Mexico, we saw the same thing. Mexico has this CONAFE program, which sends these young people in remote locations to teach, with certain sort of villages of certain size and certain enrollment. It's the same thing. They report they have inadequate preparation to teach in those difficult situations. They just don't have the multi-grade or the so forth and so on. This is a central government official from Tanzania. He says, all I'm saying, given preparation for our teachers, some are not specialized to handle disadvantaged groups. All are trained the same. Now, some get posted in an environment where kids are ready to do education, their parents are ready to support, and the other one is posted in an environment where kids don't like schooling, the parents are not supportive. That is difficult. Maybe we should, prepare our teachers better. Right? So this is sort of the overall context of difficult working conditions, lack of training or support, which is all very much part of sort of this context or this background within which this uneven distribution shows up And so now let me sort of show you some of the things that we identified as potentially important. And I mean, all of these things kind of already begin to give you a sense for why is it that a qualified adult in a developing country may not exactly be falling over themselves to go work in these environments, right? I mean, you already kind of begin to get that sense a little bit. But let me show you a few other things that we also gathered in our work that further explain this teacher distribution. And some of them speak to these policy issues as well and how governments design them. So this first sort of point is just and we've already touched upon this, is the overall national context obviously is important, right? If you are an unequal country, if you are an equal country, if you're a rich country, if you're a highly educated country, things will look good. So for example, we see relatively less unevenness in teacher education in Asia than we do in Africa. Because in Asia, most teachers are 90, 95, 99% have a basic education. So we don't see that unevenness, because everybody has a BA or whatever, some basic training. So those things are obviously very important, right? The political commitment is very important. I mean, Tom and I have a different paper where we compare South Korea with Mexico. We don't have South Korea in here, but there are societies which are, more homogeneous, where some of these things are somewhat more readily doable. The geography of the country also seems important, like Indonesia, right? I mean, it's just how do you fashion a distributive policy there compared to, say, South Korea, where, the challenges would be very different. And again, I think these are some interesting areas of work in their own right. So we do see that these things are important, right? The national context and so forth. But now let me tell you about some of the policies that we saw in play in each of our countries, sometimes a good intention, with good intention, which actually sort of kind of messes things up a little bit, right? So one of the problems is the policy of initial teacher placement, or initial teacher sort of, once you pull them, sort of they become a teacher in the labor force, where do you first put them to go teach? And something that we saw repeatedly in all of our countries is the policy that the youngest will go to the most difficult place to teach, right? Like send them out, let them do their time. And so this kind of begins to explain the demographic pattern, right? That if you're younger, that's where you go. You go to the farthest out, the most remote, whatever, and then rise your way up and come here. So there is that problem, and then there is another is that, like in Karnataka, which is a very nice, is a state in India, has a nice system in place where they do all this, test and performance and assign you based on performance. Now, what they do is, if you are a high performer on this teacher something or the other test, you get to have your first choice. So then the best people, by design, will choose the best posting, right? And then the left outs, who are like, oh, I can't get anywhere, will then get pushed back to the remote locations. So this is something, it was striking. We saw it everywhere. So in India, the new children have new teachers. Good for them, good luck to both. It's like, then they're left to their own devices, right? Like, these first generation learners, these are the teachers they're going to have. Or in Mexico, it's the same thing. We give the most difficult positions to those who are least experienced. This is just how we do it, right? And this feeds in, and I'll speak a little bit, in a minute about how sort of some of the seniority-based policies work. And so we'll speak about that in a minute. Or, this assignment in Tanzania, where you get assigned to your district, and then you kind of, from there, you go wherever. There is no compromise, no argument, I don't know what self-discussion means, but anyway, no self-discussion. You're fired if you don't agree, you belong to the district. So, the district officer would say, you're the youngest in the crew, and have 50 people ahead of you, you go teach in that place nobody wants to go teach, right? So this is a real problem. And then what this does is all kinds of sort of, ways in which teachers try to, as soon as they're posted, try to get out of the situation. So I'll speak about that in a minute as well. And then related to this sort of setup, which we generally see sort of happening over and over again, which is in some sense even well-intentioned, because you want to reward those who are, more experienced or more trained. We also see there is a consistent lack of incentives for these teachers then to go stick in these positions, to go be there. Fine, I sent you there, but at least I'll make it worth your while to spend your career there, or at least begin your career there. This is a quote from a respondent in India, which is kind of, a little sort of mushy, but I think it's nice. The teacher is not just a mind. the teacher is also a body, and the body needs all the same parameters that would apply to any body to stay functioning, right? I mean, those of you in the Bay, I'm just visiting, right? From the Bay Area, you would not dispute with the benefit of being in a nice environment. So I mean, this is a very obvious point that what do you expect if this person is in many of these countries more educated than an average adult to find, to sort of do in this situation. In Tanzania, for example, we repeatedly saw the importance of building homes for these teachers, giving them a home in the community. This is a report by Dr. Suleiman Sumra, who's a scholar in Tanzania, professor there. And this is a picture of a teacher's house, this hut. This is the actual picture of a teacher's house. So, this is some of the point that some of the folks you're talking to there were making, that look, I mean, this is the problem, that your teacher shifts from Dar es Salaam or wherever, a big urban center, and you're teaching in Lindi or so forth, and if this is your living condition, that's a problem, right? And so we heard of interesting cases where the community will come together and say, we want to keep this teacher, let's give them a cow, and or whatever, I don't know if that's, but let's give them an animal, let's build them a house, let's give them a couple of pots and pans, but let's keep them, right? So this idea that maybe some local incentives might work, but there is no systematic, I mean, on paper there is, but otherwise no. And then, I mean, this point can go in many other places, but this is also true. I mean, repeatedly, the lack of status or respect associated with teaching profession. And this was especially true in Tanzania, but we also saw it other places. That this is something you do when you have failed everything else, right? I mean, we actually had a respondent tell us that it would be an insult to tell a bright child to go become a teacher. Why would you say that? That's an insult to the child, right? That because the profession has such little, the prestige or the reputation. The remaining ones, the one who could not make it to regular, they have O and A levels. A level, and then the person laughs. They're the one who are teacher quality. The ones who could not get in anything, couldn't go further in the regular track, they go become teachers. So these are also important things that I think that play into this lack of incentives. And then, what we also often noticed is that not only are there no positive incentives, but often disincentives. So making things almost difficult so in India, in the state of Rajasthan, we heard about this thing called the dark zones, which sounds terrible. But I mean, I don't know if it's an official name, but basically the idea is that if you get posted to a dark zone as a teacher, you basically can't really get out that easily. I mean, you're there, you have to be there, you have to do your time, I don't know, 10 years or something. And so then what we hear in these dark zones is that the teachers would hire a proxy teacher. So I would, with my salary, hire somebody else who is, like, oh, I'm just going to give you, 1/3 or whatever of my salary. You go staff the classroom, I'm gone. Or like absent huge numbers of times and so forth, right? But so I mean, now how does this work to help retain teachers or staff these schools? Or in Mexico, this is these systems where, I mean, the ways to provide promotion to teacher would be by turning them into giving them bureaucratic options to get away from the teaching position. So instead of keeping them in the teaching role and, helping them along in that way, it's sort of, as someone mentioned, it's an escape valve to encourage people to leave the classroom and go to private positions. And then we also heard of these kinds of punishment posting. So because you are a low-performing teacher, we will send you all the way back. Now, how does that help the child who is all the way back, right? So these are sort of some of the ways in which the system, the way it is set up, kind of messes things up. And then the reverse is sort of this sort of reward. So we talked to a high-performing teacher in Tanzania, and he was very proud. He goes, myself, I can't move very far interior. They can't do that. They know this man. I'm good at, So then, so again, the same thing. This good guy will not go and teach the children who need him and all that stuff, right? So we see this sort of initial entry, which sends the younger people out, and then this different sort of incentives or lack of incentives or disincentives, which further complicate the situation. And then a related piece is sort of this what this guy begins to touch upon is this whole transfer business. It's fascinating that, and again, this is something that I at least had not thought about at all going in, is how important teacher transfers are to this equity, inequity that we see in our data. So what we saw repeatedly is that as if what happens is that if someone wants to be a teacher, they would just take the first posting that they are given because they want to be in the labor force of the teacher, And then all the energy is spent trying to get out of that difficult position, right? So just transfer out. And seniority is what gives you that leverage, right? So seniority is often, like there are point systems, and I mean, I'm talking about sort of mixing up all these countries, but like in one case, one state in India, there's a point system. You accrue points as you become more senior. More points get you moving. And so again, sort of a way in which you, you keep churning, you keep sort of like a revolving door, right? The youngest come, do their time, try and get out, and so forth and so on. So I have a couple of these quotes from, Mexico and Tanzania on the next slide. If you send a teacher from Bhopal to Morena, so Bhopal, a big city, Morena, a small city, this is Madhya Pradesh, then 90% of his energy would be spent in trying to come back, right? This is Karnataka. In Chamarajanagar, almost 1 out of every 5 teachers wants to leave, so 1 in 5. Whereas in Mandya, another sort of, this is Karnataka, so another more affluent district, 1 out of 20 want to leave. So I mean, you can think sort of, the kinds of burdens that this creates on the system. So everyone serves the rurals and then comes to the city, which is a good thing. They have an experience there, they come here. Then the person laughs. But all the oldies are inside. Like we were saying that it's just, and then, this is obviously someone Indian, so this is their status. But Mexico, you see the same thing. So Mexico has put a lot of effort into providing teachers for children who are indigenous, who speak indigenous languages. But again, the same thing happens. So, I might be speaking a particular indigenous language, and I really can best serve that location. But now I'm senior, so I'm just going to go back to the city because that's what I want. So it doesn't matter if the teacher speaks Chol, Totsil, whatever. What matters is that he has a lot of seniority, so he can move to the city. They don't want to be in the jungle. That is the major difficulty of placing teachers with indigenous language. And then we heard someone talk about the parents. Those teachers, they know that they are leaving, so they never even make the effort to know the community, to know the children, the parents. There's just that kind of lack of trust in the system. This is Tanzania. Someone said if transfers were easy, everyone would transfer. That's what people would do, right? Yes.
Just sort of to this point, in the sort of charts that you were showing us in the beginning, their experience is like years of teaching experience in the environment, right? So that's not a metric for turnover or
no, we don't
time
have.
in that school.
There we don't, but I think it speaks to the fact that, that I think the turnover is in part responsible for lower experience levels, right? I mean, foreseeably, we don't, not like we can tell it apart, but yeah, absolutely. And then this is another very interesting thing is, in India and Tanzania, marriages are very important, socially and so forth. So often marriage is a way you get out of a difficult situation. You get married to teacher so-and-so, or whoever so-and-so, and especially for women teachers, this is an easier thing. Not easier, but more commonly accepted thing. But this is sort of done. And we also heard of fake marriages, where people make up marriages. I think, so. So basically, you can sort of get some, and so this quote actually in itself is a little bit comical, and so it's there, and so basically you kind of climb up the hierarchy in some way, and now you can move as a couple, and you can say, oh, we can, here there's 2 positions open, take us in. So how
position can be also in the dark zone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But yeah, so this quote does not really fully capture some of the, but so basically the idea that marriage is one socially acceptable change in one's life circumstances with which you can request a transfer and say, look, now I'm just married, so therefore get me out of here or something, I don't know, get me something, and
Marry somebody out of the dark zone.
that, yes, that.
Like get married with a guy that is in the weather zone.
Right.
You're teaching in Modesto, you marry someone in birth.
Right. Exactly. So, and in India we see this in the the like widowhood, marriage are some of these sort of accepted categories for seeking, life changes for seeking these kinds of transfers. So therefore we also, as I said, see, at least heard about fake marriage. We didn't see, we heard about fake marriages and so forth. Birds want to fly home or whatever, right? Or this idea that teachers are sort of constantly trying to move away to more urban, better resourced locations. So this then, does lead us to think, once we see potentially, now this is, that maybe teacher labor markets in developing countries are also geographically constrained. And in the US, we are thinking about this already, right? That, and to the extent that that might be the case, this has some implications for local capacity development, local investment. Because if you think about a community which has very few local resources, the few who get educated just want to get out of there as soon as possible, right? And those who are educated outside, they don't want to come in. If they come in, they want to get out quickly as well. So then what, so this is sort of like a do everything kind of a solution, but this is an important, I think, to consider, and I think this is especially important when we think about the gender distribution. So if, women teachers don't feel safe, they don't feel comfortable, the percentage are less and less, women want to work in urban areas. So this is a real problem, right? That if you have, again, a low resource community, where women teacher will not come and work here because they don't feel safe traveling or safe staying and all of that stuff. And the women who might get somewhat educated might even leave your village and so forth. What that does for the girls studying in this in the school system is that they don't have female role models. And then what does that mean sort of in terms of the long-term implications for these girls? So you're sort of creating this vicious circle where there is low female investment today, so there is low female investment tomorrow, and on it goes. So these are some, I think, interesting potential implications of some of these things. So let me then just, so basically this kind of just is overall, it's such a complex process, and this is sort of how one way to talk about it. But anyway, I won't pause on this figure, there's too much going on. So here are some of the things that I think, and we already at that place, and I will show you one last quote, and then we have a few minutes we can just talk about it. Our study has many limitations, right? This is by no means some be-all, end-all view. But I think we think anyway that we have gained a lot of value ourselves as scholars, and there is that potential to sort of bring some of the conversations forward. So this is an important thing to think about. What are the implications? Which is to Chiki's point. We show all this, but what does it mean? Is it maybe this is fine? This is what it is. Like they don't have education or they're young, so big deal. So what are the implications of uneven teacher distribution for students with a focus on gender? And so here I have a quote I want to show you. This is a really stunning quote from India. So this is the gender stereotyping. So this is a respondent. I'm sure he was a man. He is a man. He goes, at the primary level any day, a lady teacher is always better because she attracts a little boy or little girl with her affection and motherly feelings. So more number of teachers in primary section, which is good. At the secondary level, the same respondent goes, at that level they should be able to learn to deal with men. At that stage you can't have ladies whining and pining and sympathizing with them still. You have to make strong individuals. You have to give them this and that and that. So this man is in his mind imagining a secondary education class filled with boys, right? Who is going to be there for the secondary education girls? And we now know that globally this is one of the next challenges we are looking at. The issue of secondary education access, school retention, and if these are the secondary level teachers, so this is sort of a real problem. And then here's my very low slide making ability. But then there are many other things. How should the teacher education? I think this is a real understudied question. The teacher education systems are expensive. They take a lot of effort and energy, and they don't seem to be doing very much. So how do you think about it, their responses? And various sort of policy questions, and how do we think about dealing with these teacher preferences for urban flight or wanting to stay close to sort of where comforts are, which you can't fault them for. So, anyway, but so here's what I had to say. You were a fantastic audience, and we've been already talking.